Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again to NSF leadership, Dr. Erwin Ganchinati, for joining us. And he's going to kick off and lay the foundation for the discussion today. So I'm going to turn that over to Erwin. And thank you very much in advance.
Well, thanks very much, Florence. And good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're located or when you might be listening to this webinar after the fact as well. As Florence mentioned, my name is Erwin Ganchinati, and I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as the NSF Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. So I help lead the TIP Directorate here at the National Science Foundation. And along with Florence and the rest of the team, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today, where we have an opportunity to talk about this still new program. It's sort of newly launched program, Pathways to Enable Secure Open Source. We're calling it really integrating tools together as a focusing agent as we think about this particular pathway for translation going forward. What I thought I would do is take just a couple of minutes to provide some context for why this program and why now. And I thought I would start from the focusing lens of the TIP Directorate and its mission within the National Science Foundation as a starting point. And then I will hand the floor back over to Florence to lead the rest of the webinar and dive into the details of the program itself. So as many of you may know, the TIP Directorate at the National Science Foundation is still somewhat new. We were stood up a few years back as part of the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 with the specific mission of doing three key things. Number one, to be able to accelerate science and technology to the market and to impact at the end of the day. Number two, to be able to grow a competition-ready workforce across a range of key technology areas, from artificial intelligence and the future of intelligence to thinking about quantum phenomena to thinking about advanced biotechnological capabilities and beyond, and really trying to help prepare that workforce across a range of different types of technologies and also a range of different types of jobs, everything from a bachelor's degree or a pre-bachelor's degree all the way up to a PhD or post-PhD going forward. And then the third piece of the TIP mission space, in addition to accelerating tech to the market, in addition to growing a competition-ready workforce, has always been about trying to be able to do everything that I just said in every corner of the country, recognizing that there is tremendous talent and there's tremendous technological potential in every corner of the country. And we have an opportunity to be able to invest and be able to lift up that potential for the benefit of U.S. competitiveness for the long term. So it is in that space, in that mission space, where a program like PESOSE really fits in. And in particular, I'll highlight the fact that that first element of our mission of trying to be able to accelerate tech to the market. For many years now, the NSF has led the rest of the federal government to a large extent with our implementation of the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR program. This is a program that we helped pilot for the rest of the federal government back in the 1970s and 1980s. And today it is a program that is made available by multiple agencies across the federal government in various implementations to be able to drive deep tech ventures to the point of commercial readiness and ultimately adoption in the market space. Well, that's one particular pathway. If you think about the outputs of basic science and you think about the ways in which basic science can have that impact, the notion of taking a research result and progressing it into the marketplace through a startup, ultimately leading to a larger sized company or a merger or acquisition or something to that effect, that's one potential pathway that exists in the lineage around going from lab to market. But part of TIP's mission space for the better part of our existence has really been to try to contemplate what are the various other pathways that offer researchers and students the opportunity to be able to take scientific breakthroughs, technological results emanating from research, and start to move those forward into impactful outcomes. And so a few years back, TIP specifically established the POSE program, Pathways for Open Source Ecosystems, and then a year or so ago stood up SAFE OSE, really focusing specifically on the security of open source ecosystems. And today with this webinar, we're pleased to be able to introduce PESOSE, which is an integration of those two efforts, really thinking about this additional translational pathway, not startups and small businesses, but thinking about how outputs of research could potentially become open sourced, could potentially cultivate an entire open source ecosystem, one that needs to have a foundation in security as well, but a secure open source ecosystem that could then in turn cultivate further innovation and potentially lend itself to down the road other spin-offs, startups, small businesses, other types of outputs that could germinate as a result of the work that's being done in these open source ecosystem environments. And so that's really at the core, if you will, of the motivation for why PESOS, trying to address sort of Congress's clarion call of having a unit within NSF that helps to accelerate research into the marketplace and into impactful outcomes. And recognizing that there's not a singular pathway to being able to do so, but there are in fact multiple pathways, and one of those is around open source ecosystems and the adoption of technologies in this way. I think we recognize that to be able to do this effectively, we need to be able to provide resourcing. We also need to be able to provide training and support to help researchers who may have not done this before be able to identify ways, new ways to be able to do so going forward. And so that's really at the core of this initiative. I want to emphasize that we care deeply, not just about the technology that might be progressing forward along this pathway, but we also care very much about the ecosystem that we are trying to be able to foster. How do we bring together a vibrant set of stakeholders beyond the initial research group that may have had the concept for an open source product? How do we bring together a much broader ecosystem to be able to foster that continued innovation, that continued advancement of that technology, that capability, that model, that simulation, whatever the case may be in terms of the open source product that we're looking to create an ecosystem around going forward? And then the final thing that I will say is about this program in particular is we're also very interested in welcoming a variety of different types of proposers, types of organizations um, who have an interest in taking ideas from the lab and into an open source ecosystem. So welcoming submissions, for example, from non-traditional entities to NSF. So yes, if you're a faculty member at an institution of higher education, very much welcome proposals to this program, but also welcome proposals from nonprofits and even for-profits as well that may be contemplating ways in which you could potentially progress along this particular lineage as we think about the various translational pathways to be able to take ideas from the lab and into an impactful output or an impactful outcome state. So I hope that gives you a sense for why PESOS, why we're excited about this program, how it fits into the TIP mission space, and more broadly, how it fits into the NSF mission space of not only advancing the frontiers of science and tech, but also helping to realize that science and tech on a day-to-day basis for the benefit of the economy, for the benefit of the nation's competitiveness in the long term. Before I close, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge everybody who has made this program possible, going all the way back to the inception of the POSE program many years ago. I want to especially thank our colleagues from the Computer and Information Science and Engineering and Geosciences directorates who have worked really closely with us to support this last cycle in preparation for the relaunch of the PESOS program. But I also want to thank our colleagues from all across NSF, all the directorates and offices. This is truly an all of NSF effort at the end of the day. And it is something that I think we could not do without their support, but also their subject matter expertise as we field proposals from every corner of the science and engineering enterprise in response to this program and try to make the best decisions in terms of developing a strong, robust award portfolio at the end of the day. I also want to just give a personal shout out to the folks within the TIP Directorate who've been helping to lead this work, instrumental to it. You're going to hear from Florence here in just a moment as she walks you through the details of the program and helps answer questions that you all may have. But I also want to thank Carol Bessel, the recently retired section head of the Pathways for Translation section within TIP, who's been helping to oversee this effort. Also Ashley Easley, Reed Sherman, Kenya Lara, Shanice Anderson, and Catherine Weatherly for all of their efforts, not just in the program formulation, design formulation, and now implementation, but also in efforts like this, bringing you all together as part of this webinar to be able to introduce the program and answer questions that you may have as well. So with that, my part here is done. Again, thank you all very much for your interest in this program. It's great to see such a robust response, even just on this webinar. We're very much looking forward to the proposals that you all will write to augment, complement, grow the portfolio that we've already had the opportunity to fund through POSE and Safe OSC over the last few years. And we're very much looking forward to continuing to cultivate sort of this lab to impact progression that we want to see realized through programs like PESOSE as we go forward. So Florence, with that, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Erwin. Okay, we're going to switch out on the slides. For those that are just joining us, if you have a question, I think we have the Q&A pane up. Please feel free to put those in, your questions in the pane. If we don't get through all of those, we'll certainly have an opportunity to talk in more detail about some other questions. I'm going to pick up where Erwin left off. I'm going to walk you through how we're going to use the time today. But what I want you to think about is what this session is about. It's about your grounding point. It's an overview, a map of the PESOSE landscape, and basically an orientation today. So this is going to be a broad view. We will have 2 other webinars I'm going to mention, at least 2 other webinars. We've been talking about maybe adding a couple more if it makes sense. The second webinar is going to be a deep dive into the Q&A. So today we're just not going to have time to go into a lot of context-specific questions, but don't worry, we'll have at least 1, maybe 2. And then the third webinar is going to be about proposal preparation. And while we know there are a lot of questions around proposal preparation, we want to separate those out from the broader questions. In the interim, I want to encourage you, next slide. If you've got questions between now and the second webinar, please feel free to email those to the PESOSE@nsf.gov mailbox. There is a generic phone number, which we do check. Chances are, though, you're going to have a better luck if you put your Q&A in the PESOSE mailbox. So the Q&A pane is open today. Please put your questions in there. If you don't get an answer today, feel free to send it to the mailbox. We'll do our best to get those answered before the second session. If not, we'll have a third session. So plenty of time to get your questions answered. So next slide. So I mentioned I'm going to walk you through the agenda, and here's where we're headed today. First, we're going to do a quick overview of the PESOSE program scope. We're going to break down each of the 3 tracks. We're going to talk about funding levels, measures of success, eligibility requirements, and required activities such as I-Core for PESOSE. And then we're going to walk through some tips and strategies to strengthen your submissions if you're interested in proposing to this program, or those pitfalls that we've seen through experience. And after that, we'll open the floor for your questions. Okay, next slide. So before we jump into the program itself, I wanted to provide you a little background, and I think Erwin covered this quite a bit. Open source is a way that amplifies innovation. So it's more than just the software. It's more than just the code repository. It's a managed and deliberately developed community with governance, security practices, users, contribution, and contribution pipeline. So we want you to hear that. You'll hear us say it over and over again. This is not just about a technology or a product. As Erwin mentioned, NSF has been a leader in open source ecosystem. And I've listed a few here just to give you a sampling across the agency. And at the end, I'll have a slide on these, a couple of samples, not the only ones, but we wanted to just, again, provide a sampling. And some of this has been around since 2013 or even sooner. So we've got Cyverse out of the Biological Sciences Directorate. We have the Molecular Science Software Institution out of the Mathematical and Physical Sciences Directorate. We have Open Science Framework out of Social and Behavioral Economics, and then Open Source Ecosystem for Hydrological Education Research and Operations out of the Geosciences. So you can see that for a long time, NSF has had a leadership in the open source ecosystem. POSE advances that work and continues, as Erwin would say, this innovation acceleration, this lab to market. And by strengthening and securing open source ecosystem, it furthers the research in this area and the national effort. So next slide. So a bit of the overview of the PESOSE program. If you're not familiar with the numbering or you can't find it, you can search on NSF 26506. If you search on POSE or Safe OSC, you're going to get a screen that says it's been archived. So you want to be looking at PESOSE. We've talked a little bit about this. So PESOSE is about the creation of the managing organizations for ecosystem with governance, distributed development, user communities, and across academia, industry, and government. So we want you to hear this piece about the managing organization, these other elements. And while we also support the translation of these research products into safe and sustainable ecosystems, we also recognize they have to be towards a national societal challenge. So think big. And lastly, we want you to think about what those open source tools are and think about them in a broader context. It's not just software. It could be hardware. It could be machine learning models, languages, and data platforms. They're designed to be shared, and they're designed to be publicly available and modifiable by the public, by the community. So these are not research products that are developed by a single entity or a single individual. Next slide. We haven't talked about this yet, but I want to mention, if you didn't see our Dear Colleague letter, 26015, this year we introduced and we highlighted our interest in receiving proposals around AI agent protocol ecosystems. So as we mentioned, if you're familiar with AI agents, these are capabilities that rely on, they extend beyond simple chat interfaces. And they rely on open interfaces and shared standards that allow these agents to communicate with each other. So an AI agent ecosystem is this network of autonomous agents that communicate, and they let the agents build by different organizations or using different frameworks. So I want to highlight this. It doesn't mean that NSF has a set aside. We want to call this out as an area of interest to NSF. So any proposals received under this Dear Colleague letter would be processed just like the rest of the PESOSE proposals. Next step. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual picture, but sometimes it's easier to see this visually than us just talking. So on the left-hand side part of the screen, is Erwin mentioned this early on, is NSF has a long history of generating research products and research tools. We even have a history of developing open source products through scientists, engineers, educators. And out of that effort, we have products. PESOSE is that bridge between those activities and building ecosystems. So if we look to the right of the screen, this is what PESOSE is enabling. And I want you to focus on not only the open source product, but all of those elements around it, the governance structures, the documentation related to all of these elements. Continue to need the scientists, engineers, and educators to be a part of this. You'll need onboarding processes. You have a developer community in theory. You have external users. You have a developer community and distributed development activities, defect management, and of course, security. So PESOSE is about enabling this ecosystem, enabling the building of this ecosystem around this open source product. It is not this activity on the left-hand side, which we often get submissions for. So if you're thinking about, if you're a scientist or engineer, you've got a product and you've recently made it open source, that's not going to be enough. I want to pause on this for a minute, give you guys a chance to really sit and look at what we're talking about. Okay, next. So I'm going to say it again, slightly different. PESOSE is not the development open source artifacts, tools, or products. So if you're planning to develop a tool or a product and it's open source, NSF has other programs that are related to this infrastructure. And we mentioned some of this. SISE has some of this, some of our other directorates fund this kind of work. PESOSE is bigger than this. We're also not designed to fund well-resourced open source communities and ecosystems. This is about how to use the money to catalyze the activities, how to use the little bit of money that NSF has to catalyze this work and building those ecosystems. And then lastly, PESOSE is not about open source ventures where profit is the primary motive. Erwin mentioned that we are interested in non-standard communities proposing to NSF there, so there's nothing wrong with a for-profit company. But the effort can't be totally and alone about making money or for-profit, right? That's another effort. So not about the development of, solely about the development of open source artifacts, tools, or products. So this is why PESOSE, when we talk about it, you'll hear us talk about the budget, not including research. It's about that ecosystem piece, the right-hand side of that image that we showed you. If you're already well-resourced you're working with an open source community and ecosystem, PESOSE is probably not the place to be. Right, we're in the development, early stage, and getting groups off the ground. And lastly, if you're already well-established and you're making money, we believe that you're already well on your way and is not for PESOSE as well. So next slide. So we talked a little bit about having 3 tracks. And if you're familiar with POSE and you're familiar with Safe OSC, I'm going to try to trace it back so you understand where PESOSE sits. It's basically a relaunch of the 2 programs. Much has not changed. So track 1 is about scoping and planning, or that establishment of an open source ecosystem. This is for teams that are beginning of their ecosystem journey. So if you're building a governance structure, you've got plans to think about how you're licensing, so you know how you want to do it, or you're building that plan. You're not sure how you're going to do your community pathways, but you're planning on that already. You have documentation or plans or timelines for how you're going to build that documentation and your foundational operations. So if you have a product already and you're preparing to grow that ecosystem and you have plans around that, you haven't quite figured out all the places where you need to be, you belong with track 1. Track 2 is about establishing and expanding a sustainable ecosystem. And this is based on your track 1 typically, is what did you scope? What did you plan? And how are you going to now establish what you propose to do and expand it beyond your original thinking? And most importantly, track 3 is not a continuation of track 2. So I want to make sure that this is well understood. Is track 3 is almost a standalone in and of itself. It's about a focus on safety, security, and privacy of a mature ecosystem. It does not have to be one that perhaps you're proposing that you've developed yourself or that your team has developed. It's about a mature one that you've identified some vulnerabilities, and for sure you have to be working with those original developers or within that ecosystem space. But it is not an extension of track 2. So track 1 and track 2, think about those as phase 1 and phase 2 in POSE, and then track 3 is Safe OSC. Next, please. So I said this originally, scoping and planning, it's about that ecosystem discovery. Do you know who your customers are? Do you know who your users are? How are you going to find your developers? How are you going to launch? All of those things are about ecosystem discovery. It's about understanding what your organizational and governance models might look like. Not only just understanding, but exploring and planning for one. Your infrastructure, what is that architecture that you're going to be using? Where's your repository going to be? What is your product going to be? How are these things going to connect? This is about planning. And lastly, but most importantly, it's about that community building. Bringing users to your community doesn't happen passively. It's an active process. How are you going to bring people on board? How are you going to get their attention? If you build it, how will you get them to come? So this is about planning. It's about building a blueprint for building that open source ecosystem. Next slide, track 2. Track 2 then is taking track 1, taking those plans and building those out. So it's actually establishing the ecosystem. So starting to build that out. So you've got some organizational models or governance models that you plan for, that you laid out a timeline for. Now it's time to organize and establish those. The same with how are you going to develop and integrate and deploy your infrastructure? One and done, right? It's not one and done, of course. You're going to have to plan for continuous development in the open, in the public space. You've got a long-term strategy that you proposed or you thought about in your track one, if you proposed for that, and your community building. So it's about moving that forward and not just planning for it, but actually executing against that. And the last piece is the sustainability goals and thinking about how are you going to measure or evaluate how you're doing. Sustainability is not just about the money. Sustainability, you've got to have a pipeline, a continuous pipeline of users, developers, maintainer. So sustainability, I want you to think about it as all those other elements that we've been talking about, especially the human elements, the contributors, the users, the maintain. How are you going to keep them coming to your site and wanting to help and maintain that? That's as much about the sustainability as the finances are. So having a plan for that and then beginning to execute on that. And you have 2 years to do that. Next slide. And then track 3. This is about the improvement, the safety, security, and privacy from an existing OSC and its products. So if you were to look at the solicitation, we talk about a mature OSC. It's not likely going to be an OSC that's coming out of a track 1, perhaps likely not an OSC coming out of a track 2. So if you're thinking about you've got a track 2 that's finishing up and you want to extend something into track 3, probably not the route to go. It's probably not mature enough. It may or may not be wide enough. It's not a hard line, but probably not that. And we're thinking about interoperability, scalability, and security. So next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm sure that everybody's thinking about the money and the awards and track 1. So not a lot of changes, no changes actually from the POSE and SAFE OSC. So 300,000 per award. It's a 1-year award. Will, depending upon funds and availability, up to 30 awards. Track 2 is $1.5 million per award, approximately 10. And track 3 is about $1.5 million as well, approximately 10. So you'll notice we talk about approximate numbers. It's dependent on funds availability as well as the quality of the proposals. So by merging these programs, it does give us a chance to put some money or move money around where it's best placed. So we're always looking at the portfolio management aspect of this. But so we talk about up to 30 awards. It doesn't mean there'll always be 30. Next slide. A couple of important notes. If you're not paying attention or you haven't thought about this, you didn't see this in the solicitation. So we talk about these experiential activities. If you happen to be recommended for an award for track 1 or track 2, you must participate in the what we call the experiential activities I-Core for PESOSE. So if you've thought about our I-Core, you've heard about it before. This one has been modified and tailored for this program. There are some waivers if you've been in a track 1, you've done this already. So, but bottom line is if you get a track 1 or track 2 award, you must participate. And why do we want this? Because we believe that the customer discovery and understanding who your customers are, your users, your developers, is central to a successful open source ecosystem. And learning how this is done and understanding the methodologies behind it is, we think, a plus up, and the feedback we're getting is very much so. Collaborations, if you're submitting to NSF, we would encourage you to collaborate with multiple entities. However, we just need one lead organization. All other entities that are collaborating would have to submit as a subaward. And then lastly, this is an interesting piece, if you probably didn't see this, is about the PI eligibility. So under PESOSE, the PI is really dependent on the submitting organization. And why do we do that? Meaning that in some capacity, either have to be working or formally associated with the submitting organization. We need this kind of relationship because you have to have the proper authority, responsibility, and continuity. And you can do that by having this formal relationship, legal relationship with the lead entity. Okay, next slide. You heard Erwin talk about this. if you're from a traditional IHE or institution of higher education, 2 or 4 years, we welcome you back. This is just abbreviated text from the solicitation. We welcome nonprofits, non-academic institutions. In particular, we're very interested. We run the gambit, interested in everything from a museum to research laboratories, professional societies. So we're very, very broad in our thinking about who can submit. For-profit organizations as well, including small businesses and state and local governments, are also welcome. And then lastly, tribal nations. There's a particular federal law that an American Indian or Alaskan Native tribe, band, nation, pueblo, village, or community, all welcome and eligible to submit. And we get this last question a lot. Other federal agency, FFRDCs, or federally funded research and development centers require some specifics around the eligibility. I would encourage you to go to the NSF proposal guide, the proposal and policy guide that we call PAPPG, and we could talk about that more if you belong in one of these camps and you're interested. So out of the gates, you are generally eligible, but there's some details that we have to go over before we can just accept a proposal. Next slide. Okay, deadlines. Upcoming deadline for this fiscal year is September 1st. It's an annual deadline, meaning every year thereafter, it's the first Tuesday in September, and that may shift a little bit. But this year, it's September 1st. Our second deadline then is in March 2027. Similarly, it's an annual deadline, and the exact date is going to possibly move around a little bit, but it's the first Tuesday in March. So annual deadlines, the first one coming is September 1st. We're going to accept all 3 tracks in that proposal deadline. So if you're thinking about submitting, deadline is approaching soon. Next slide. So how do you think about your success or impact? And if you were possibly heard what Erwin was saying, he's talking about how do you measure the success of your open source ecosystem? This isn't about how do you assess the health of your ecosystem, but how do you measure the impact of your open source ecosystem? And we're just going to give you a few here that you could think about as you write up your evaluation plan, or you think about how you want to understand how your ecosystem is doing. So we think about it through discovery and innovation, things like data sets that have been established or expanded, startups, new technologies or techniques established. We think about, of course, the STEM education and workforce, participants, and if they're hired into a STEM field, and research infrastructure, new infrastructure that's built. I want to emphasize this is not about the health of your ecosystem. This is about how to measure the impact of that ecosystem once it's established. How do you anticipate thinking about its impact? These are not the only ones. These are the ones that we offer up certainly in the solicitation. If you've got questions or ideas, certainly welcome to ask those kinds of questions in the Q&A today or in the mailbox. Next. We're getting into some of the proposal things, but I do want to mention this because this comes as a surprise. We don't want you to be thinking about this, thinking about a phase 2 or a track 2 and then be surprised. So you must have a pointer to an existing publicly available open source product. That's a minimum. So if you're thinking about a track 1, you need this link. You also need this for a track 2, obviously. That's a much more mature ecosystem. Is already in many ways on its way. You have to talk about the status, the current status, not only on the product development, but the rest of the ecosystem itself. So you must talk about the dissemination, that publicly available piece, the user base, and the contributor base, to name a few. That's the details about your ecosystem, not just about the product, which we get a lot of proposals that do that. Want to hear about what's the problem you're trying to solve. That seems like it's basic, but oftentimes it's not clear what problem is trying to solve or what problem this open source ecosystem is going to assist with. And then, of course, we think about the team. And we oftentimes just look at the team members, the PI or the senior personnel. That's oftentimes what you look at. But we're looking at the entire team collectively. What is that ecosystem? How are you going to get that user base onboarded? It's all about the team. And you need a strong justification for why your team is best positioned to build this ecosystem. Next slide. Okay, this is what I call the strengthened submissions. These are common pitfalls that we see in proposals. The first one is, and these are track 1 and track 2, if you remember, we're talking about building an ecosystem, that blueprint, and establishing that ecosystem, which is track 2, is you need to make a strong case this is really an issue of significant societal or national importance. You may have a very interesting research product, but how does this translate to the bigger picture? Why does society care about it? Why does the nation care about it? You've got a long-term vision. How are you going to sustain the open source ecosystem? Remember our discussion around how are you going to onboard users? How are you going to get their attention? 2 years down the road, when this isn't the shiny new open source ecosystem, how are you going to continue to have those contributors? How are you going to get data maintainers that want to do this? Perhaps not being paid, maybe they'll be paid something. How's that all going to work? So what's your vision about the sustaining piece? This last piece, the recruitment strategy for your new contributors. How are you going to grow your user base? This doesn't happen passively. So how are you going to bring new contributors continuously to the system, and how are you going to grow that user base? Very, very deliberate kinds of actions. And lastly on this is be specific in your planning and evaluation. So as you write up your proposal, if you just write generically, and we'll get into this in webinar 3 a little bit to give you some examples, we need you to be very, very specific. What are those milestones you're trying to meet? And what are those actions? More than just a very general set of activities, like planning, evaluating. Those are too general. And this is more than just the cyber technology. So if you've got a platform, it's got to go beyond that. As I mentioned, the recruitment strategy. How are you going to keep those new users coming? How are you going to get contributors, et cetera? So next slide. Continuing on this thought process, as I mentioned, I duplicate this because it's so important to us. It's about the recruitment strategy for retaining those contributors and the sustainability piece. Thinking about your licensing approach and having details around that is important. And building and testing your infrastructure. It's not good enough to say I have a platform, but you need to think about how are you going to build it beyond where you are today into tomorrow? How are you going to test that infrastructure? And then how are you going to work with the quality control and security of new content as it's developed, as it's added? So these are track 1, track 2, just a sampling of what I would call the points of strength. So these are pitfalls if you don't do this. These are things that we see over and over again that don't necessarily get talked about or don't get addressed. It's not the entire list. It's a frequently observed list. So next slide. So when I call this out, this is especially important. And it's a recommendation because we see that oftentimes teams will go it alone. And what do I mean by that? If you're an IHE and you're a PI and a co-PI, traditional research faculty, and you look at this long list of activities and you say to yourself, how in the world am I going to do this? How do I build all these pieces? You need to get other groups involved. And I want to put a plug in for these, we call it intermediary or backbone organizations. They're out there, lots of these, and their job is to sustain open source ecosystem. They do this a variety of things, training and governance, sponsorship, community building. They know how to do this. They're experts in the field. I've listed a few here. If you don't recognize their names, it's because oftentimes they're in the background working. It's that silent army of people that are moving these activities along. So take a look. These are a sampling. You can find dozens of these groups. But I want to put a plug in this. don't go this alone and use the expertise that's out there. That's going to save you a whole lot of headache. They have built-in expertise and people in these groups to understand how to do this ecosystem building. So if you're trying to do it alone, you're probably taking the harder route and it's going to slow you down. So call out to a couple of these groups. I just randomly picked them for a range of things. The Carpentries, this is about community-led training and coding and data and research computing. They develop instructors in local communities, so they understand how to work with the communities. Focus, another ones, they provide fiscal sponsorship, governance support, fundraising, community services. Got a couple of projects that we listed here, NumPy, Jupyter, and Pandas. The Software Freedom Conservancy, fiscal sponsorship again, legal services, license compliance, and nonprofit management. And the Open Source Collective provides financial infrastructure and fundraising support. So put a big plug in here for here. So your submission is going to be much stronger if you reach out to these kinds of groups rather than keeping it within your small group if you're not experienced in this ecosystem realm. Next slide. I'm going to try and wrap up. We have about 4 minutes so that I can get to Q&A. And lastly, track 3. And remember, this is about the vulnerabilities. So your proposal is going to be much stronger. If you can think about the vulnerability landscape, you need to talk about that, right? For not only the OSC that you've picked, but its products. You have to have a plan for addressing those critical vulnerabilities. So not just solving it, but you got to talk about what your planning is around that. Similar to track 1 and track 2, what is the testing infrastructure and what are your plans on building that or using it or extending it if you have it already? And then, like the other tracks, be very specific about what your milestones are and your evaluation plan to assess where you are and the progress of your work. Next slide. So a couple of plugs, get engaged with NSF PESOSE. There's no other better way to learn what it really is about is to get engaged. We have a barcode. We really want to hear about if you have any open source ecosystems that you want to tell us about for some reason. Not necessarily just your submission, but if you've got something you really want to tell us about, let us know. We are actively thinking about an open source conference. If you're interested, we want to hear that as well. So please scan the QR code. Let us know if you're interested in that open source conference or an open source conference. Next slide. Of course, we want to put a plug in for being a reviewer. This is if you have never reviewed for NSF or you have, but not this program, we could always use reviewers. One note, just want to remind you, if you're proposing to this program, you cannot serve as a reviewer until that proposal has been fully processed. So if you're thinking about submitting to September 1 deadline, you can't sign up to be a reviewer. However, you can still sign up. You just can't be in this next round. Potentially, depending upon how quickly I can get things processed, you may not be able to participate in the following round, but nothing stops you or nothing's going to happen automatically. So I would encourage you, if you have any interest, please sign up for being a reviewer. We've got a form behind this. It helps us understand where you'd best fit in the panels as the proposals come in. And by the way, this year we added some additional tagging. So if you belong in that group of the governance, the data maintainers, the users and contributors, please sign up. We are absolutely going to include those individuals with that kind of experience in these proposals. We want that firsthand perspective, not just the technology designers and OSC product developers. We want to have that broader representation on the panels. So next slide. And with that, I want to thank you. And again, you can scan this QR code. It's available. It's going to talk about PESOSE, a bit about what I covered today, and more details, traditional solicitation. And it's 1:44. So I promised to give 15 minutes to the Q&A, and my colleague Reed is on the line as well as another colleague, Marlon. So they're going to help pull those questions forward. So what do we have in the way of questions? Reed, do you want to start us off?
Yes, hello. Yeah, there are about 70, 80 questions in the Q&A. So various members of the team have been going in and typing answers. There are still many that we haven't gotten to. Um, I'm trying to pick out an example for you to answer live. Um, there's a question about foreign collaborations. Um, that are allowed as long as, that are generally allowed as long as NSF funds do not support activities abroad. Uh, and the question is, open source code at the center of a potential proposal has been developed jointly with colleagues at universities abroad. How can those foreign collaborators participate meaningfully and benefit from the project without receiving NSF funds? And would their involvement require any change in ownership, governance rights, or management control for a PESOSE proposal?
So the fundamental, or I think the most basic policy statement around having international collaborators is that no NSF money can flow directly to those entities. So either directly through the award, through the original lead institution or subawards. This doesn't mean that should affect your governance structures. It all depends. And I'm going to get to my colleague Solchuk, who has raised his hand, but the guidance that we've had in the past is no money shall flow from NSF to those foreign entities. This should not affect, or this has no bearing, in our opinion, on how you run your governance structure. That's really purely up to those entities. But Solchuk, do you want to add some comments around that?
Yes, I want to also add, can you hear me? Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
So this is also regulated by the universities that or the organization's policies or the state policies. So in addition to NSF, you also need to check your, let's say if it's an academia, you need to check with your academic entity about the foreign, every state has a different, regulation, Florida versus, Georgia versus Texas versus, California. So you will also need to, and then NSF expects you as the PIs to check with your institution's regulations as well and abide by those regulations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Solchuk. And oftentimes I won't say this explicitly, but it's always the case that there's the NSF policies, and then overlaid on top of that is your institution's business policies that may be more restrictive. That's what we're talking about. So from an NSF perspective, as long as the money is not flowing to those entities, we're fine. But that doesn't mean actually your state or your local policies and processes may accept those as well. So you want to do a two-step. I think the question, though, was about how can you meaningfully participate if we're not paying you? Well, we know with open source ecosystems, not everybody gets paid. It doesn't mean that you can't participate. It just means that the money can't flow from the NSF perspective. So I can't speak to every different governance structure, but I'm sure there's many, many that have arranged for these interactions, these international interactions that involve contributions or involve maintenance through somebody from an international entity. I imagine attendance at a workshop, for example, could be a way that you can meaningfully participate without getting money directly from NSF. So what else do we have in the way of questions? Reed?
Yeah, so another question that's in the Q&A is an ecosystem for developing an open technical standard that is supported by standards developing organization, that is supported by a standards developing organization, a good fit for PESOSE?
So this is an interesting question. We've gotten this before. On the surface, I'm just going to answer in a very general way. The answer is no. This is not a standards development activity. We understand, remember, this is about everything around a particular platform, a particular product in and of itself. And I understand there's lots of arguments about whether a standard in and of itself is a product. At least for now, we're not interpreting it in that way. It doesn't mean that standards aren't an important or necessary aspect of an open source ecosystem, or can even be a part of that. It's just not the central theme right now. So this is not a standards development program, or it's not a standards program as well. So not an SDO, SOO activity or the products around that. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't use standards or you couldn't develop standards within this broader ecosystem. It's just not the focus.
There have been a few questions about the fact that funding is intended for ecosystem development rather than tool development, and questions around how much tool development or tool evolution would be allowed in such a proposal. So, and one question says, I have an open source project that requires a mechanism for developing and distributing plugin style software components for a core product. The core product needs to be evolved in order to be sustainable. Would that development be supported in a PESOSE proposal?
So the general answer is yes. We understand that this integration, this development, especially as your ecosystems build, you get more developers, more maintainers, your platform or your product has to grow and has to develop. The percentage or the amount of money, that's really, we don't have a hard and fast, it's an X percentage. It's really on a case-by-case basis. I'd say a general rule of thumb, if you get anywhere above 15%, 20%, we're going to start questioning that. But it's a case-by-case basis. But really good point is integration, evolution of those products is necessary, right? Especially as you're growing. And so I would say if you've got this, you want to make the case using this particular example, why this particular development is necessary to grow or to scale or to bring new users on. If you're evolving it to feed the same group of users or developers, then the argument or the justification is harder. But if you're doing it because there's a major issue, either around security or as you connect to other open source ecosystems, that's a perfect justification. But keep your eye on it. Hard and fast rule is we don't have one. Like many things, it's really dependent on the context.
There have also been a handful of questions around sort of choosing the right track and maturity level. So, for instance, do track 1 and track 2 proposals need to have a safety, security, privacy angle? And then another question about that track 2 seems like there's a sweet spot of maturity that's targeted, and how much of an ecosystem, what level of maturity is then too mature to get even a track 2 proposal?
Right. So let's start with the maybe the first one. Yes, absolutely. Safety, security, and privacy lens. Absolutely. So think about your data management plan, best practices. So explicitly in all NSF proposals, unless otherwise specified, you do have to speak to that data management. That's going to include safety and security, right? That's just a necessary part of the open source ecosystem. And certainly if you're working in the software realm, you'd be remiss not having that. Maturity level, when do you cap out at being a type 2, I think is the question, is what maturity is too mature. So again, not a hard and fast rule, but if you've already got a well-funded ecosystem that's humming along, probably not. If you can't make the case of why the NSF money is going to catalyze your ecosystem, then probably not going to be funded. It doesn't mean you can't come in and can't try, but you want to think about the proposal funding, the $1.5 million. What is that going to catalyze if you've already got sustainability? You've already got contributors, developers. If you've not figured out how to do that, that's probably not a good case for it. So if you went ahead and submitted to a track 2, so you don't necessarily need to submit a track 1 in order to move to a track 2, but let's just say you submitted to a track 1. You developed your blueprint, you got funded, and then you want to submit to a track 2, and then you finish the track 2 and you say, well, you look up and your user community or your developer community is not quite as big. You haven't figured out how to do the sustainability. I would argue that's probably a little bit too late. Or if you've gotten funding already and you've got a huge community, you've attracted all kinds of entities, it'd be a hard case to make where NSF could catalyze. It doesn't mean you can't, it just means that the probability is fairly low that you're going to be able to make that strong case. So think about where that money could be used to catalyze it. If you look at what you have, look at who's involved, and see if you can make the case. If you can make the case, then maybe the reviewers will support it or recommend supporting it. It's all about the kind of case that you make, and extending given more time to extend sustainability is not a strong case in and of itself. Next question.
So there are also a handful of questions about the letters of collaboration requirement, and who makes a good submitter of a letter of collaboration. For instance, could they be people who are not, or people or organizations that are not currently users but plan to be in the future, or what else is being looked for in the letters of collaboration?
Right. So we want confidence to know that you're actually speaking with groups, or that you're pulling in entities that are actively engaged in your ecosystem. So asking a friend to write a collaboration letter is probably not going to go anywhere. So think about who you're asking. What role do they play? Or what role do you intend that group to play? And how do you convince the reviewers and NSF that relationship is adequately developed, or that you understand what that relationship is? And it's just not somebody that says, yeah, I like that open source, that idea. So it's about the relationship. Is that individual able to speak to that, and what role they might play or how they support it? So general letters of support, not helpful at all. It's about collaboration. What role does that individual, what are they going to play in the bigger ecosystem? And a generic user, probably difficult to sell that that's really a helpful contribution or justification for making a case for the ecosystem.
There are also some questions about the September deadline, March deadline, whether the expected number of awards is for the entire fiscal year or just for the first deadline, and whether and how the awards are spread out over the two submission deadlines in the year.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this very broadly. And then if you attend the third webinar or the fourth webinar, depending on how many of these Q&A sessions, the totals are for the entire fiscal year. How that works in times of portfolio balance, we can talk about when we get into this proposal processing and asking questions around that. But let's just say you can imagine that what a challenge this presents, right? Having a set of proposals in September, you want to get that review, and then you've got another one coming up, and you don't have the benefit of sitting on all those proposals. So there's a bit of juggling that we do, and processes for how do we think about the portfolio, and how do we manage over two timelines or two deadlines that are over almost 8 months total. So it is for the whole year, total amounts, total numbers.
And then a few people have also asked about getting in touch with program officers to discuss, their particular ideas and whether they would be a good fit for a particular track. So just felt that's a good question to address before we close today.
Yeah, the PESOSE mailbox, and please bear with us. I think we've done our best to try to answer all those. If you put it in the PESOSE mailbox, please, please, please make your subject line meaningful, because we are able to track things down much faster if we understand what the email is about. But when we get one line subject or one word subject lines, or we get some really obtuse statement, we can't help you. If you put it in the mailbox, we have a working group, and we do talk about proposals or questions that come up kind of collectively. But bear with us, especially with the end of the fiscal year. We're scrambling to get all the questions. We're going through those now if we haven't answered one before. If it's project specific, in other words, you're going to lay out your whole project and you want our opinion on it, likely it's going to be hard for us to answer that. If you have an award with us already, we're still answering those kinds of questions. But if you want us to look at your proposal and go through the whole thing, or an abbreviated description, that's going to be a little bit hard. But if you have particular questions, we can get into those. And certainly the Q&A session, usually attendees find those very helpful. So we have 1 minute. Let me just put a plug in. I think that's all the questions we're going to take. So we have the Q&A inbox. Thanks, Reed. So we're going to go through that inbox. We're going to prepare for the second webinar. We have not laid out the date. It's probably going to be before July 15th, so that we leave plenty of time for teams that are proposing. If we get a huge response or questions that we can't answer through that period, we'll have another one, we'll schedule another one. And certainly we'll have this fourth webinar on proposal preparation. The fourth webinar, we're going to talk about that process somebody was asking about. How does it work? Who reviews my proposal? What about this portfolio balancing? How do I think about my budget? All of those little details, the letters of collaboration, what should they look like? Why did I get rejected the last time? This is going to be a very mechanical question. So I'm looking at it's 2:00. We promised an hour and we're at that hour, top of the hour. And at this point, I think we're going to end the webinar. Be on the lookout. You have the QR codes now. It'll take us a couple days to get this webinar posted, but stay in touch via the PESOSE mailbox. We will answer it. Just be patient and be on the lookout for those other webinar dates. And thanks to everyone for joining. I hope you learned something about the program and this was helpful. So thanks very much.